Welcome everyone. We're so excited to have everyone here joining us today. We had an overwhelming response and interest in today's webinar, and we're just so excited to be able to share this topic with you all. Today's conversation is going to be around housing solutions for LGBTQ survivors, and we're excited to be able to explore this topic. Next slide. Today's webinar is being brought to you by the Freedom Network Training Institute in the Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project. We are the housing training and technical assistance provider under the Office for Victims of Crime. And so what that means is that we support service providers around understanding housing resources and solutions and best practices around housing for survivors of trafficking. We do hold bi-monthly webinars, and we also have a number of resources such as fact sheets and templates available on our resource library. And we're so excited to be able to cover today's topic with some great individuals joining us today. Next slide. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from three fantastic individuals sharing their expertise with us. So I just want to give a quick intro to each one of them. Christy Croft, pronouns they, them, is the Prevention Education Program Manager for the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. In there, they provide training and technical assistance to rape crisis centers, dual domestic violence agencies, and human trafficking programs across the state. They also serve in their county's homelessness board and they have been active as an LGBTQ activist and community organizer for over 25 years. We also have Drea Sertilin, pronouns she, her, and she has received her degree from sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. And from there, she was able to find her passion of bringing male and LGBTQ populations of sex trafficking victims to light by advocating for more specifically tailored services and resources. Drea has partnered with sex trafficking task forces to help in recovery operations, which involve service-based interactions as an alternative to incarceration. And finally, we have Jess Torres, pronouns they, them. They are a queer migrant from El Salvador, and they were raised in New York City. They are a strong advocate in the anti-trafficking movement and the Survivor Leadership Program Coordinator at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, CAST. Jess also serves as the co-chair for the National Survivor Network, which is a collective of over 250 human trafficking survivors, as well as a Los Angeles group called Resilient Voices. And Jess is also a 2019 Women's Policy Institute Fellow, successfully passing their human trafficking initiative in the state of California. So as you can see, we have a lot of expertise that we are really excited to learn from. Next slide. For today, we are really hoping to dive into the challenges that LGBTQ survivors face regarding housing. And so that's an area that we are very excited to explore, and probably an area that many of you have also found challenges with. So we invite you to please share your experience through the chat box, and also share any sort of resources or areas and successes that have worked out well in your community. We're also going to be sharing ideas about models that can promote access to safe and stable housing and how you and your organization can implement these practices. Next slide. Perfect. So we want to get started with a quick poll, and we would love some candid and very honest feedback. We want to know if you believe that your program is inclusive and accessible to LGBTQ survivors. So if you'll just click on your answer and then hit submit, we'll give it a couple moments so that way we can get a good participation going. Perfect. And we'll go ahead and start closing it out, and we will broadcast the results. Perfect. Great. So as you can see, there's a good mix. It sounds like the majority of programs or participants today do feel like they have an inclusive and accessible program for LGBTQ plus survivors. There's definitely some that are unsure and some that may not be there yet. So we're very excited to have the spectrum of people who are going to be at different places and can contribute to this conversation. Next slide. We're going to go ahead and get it kicked off, and I'm going to turn it over to Jess.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate your participation. So I'm going to get it started with a little bit more of an overview as well. We're going to be discussing, just for some additional insight, how the systems that generate human trafficking and sort of the global injustices that plague our societies and their solutions are all sort of intra and interrelated, and identifying those feedback loops or systemic drivers and those leverage points. So in systems thinking, a leverage point is a place in a system structure where a solution element can be applied. So when we think about that, we need a change force, right? And the change force is the effort required to prepare and make the change in outcome, which usually takes a shift in awareness or knowledge, skills or resources, and sometimes behavior. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and also about how if we design systems with that avoid essentially the reinforcement loops that push results in the wrong directions, because we all love to celebrate our successes of our programs, which is like an incredibly important piece. But how is that also, how is that reinforcing loop encouraging the system to continue in that direction? And how are we creating processes that provide notice to us when things are moving in the wrong direction? And that is a really critical point. And how do we institute countermeasures to avoid the results that reinforcing loop would provide? So some of those things we're going to touch on are just, about like the absence of judgment and how relationships can take on a new quality, where there are no mistakes and simply experiences that point us to a deeper truth about ourselves and the world. And note that I did not say that there is an absence of accountability, but in my experience, when we meet situations with anger, shame, or blame, these feelings like disconnect us from others and ourselves. So in this new space we're creating, we're really embracing the possibility that we play a part in creating the problem and a part in creating the solution. Because in those earlier paradigms, we often convince ourselves that everything is right until a problem has snowballed and hit us like an avalanche, and forcing that change into our lives. Now we can make frequent small adjustments as we learn and grow from problems that we encounter along the way. As we're in previous stages, like change on a personal level felt threatening, here it can feel evolutionary. And so other things that we'll be touching on a little bit are like a TGI 101, and TGI stands for transgender, gender nonconforming, or gender variant, gender expansive. And the I stands for intersex. We're going to touch on trauma-informed care, and because the issue of housing is intersectional, we're going to talk a tiny bit about like economic development and health quality and social capital and collective impact. So I just wanted to frame those things for us. When we talk about collective impact, that approach is the premise or the belief that no single policy or government department or organization or program can tackle or solve the increasingly complex social problems we face. So some of the key elements are that all participants have a common agenda for change, including this shared understanding of the problem and a joint approach to solving it through agreed upon actions, collecting data and measuring results consistently across all of the participants. So ensuring that shared measurement for alignment and for accountability, a plan of action that outlines and coordinates like mutually reinforcing activities for each participant, open and continuous communication across all the many players to build trust and assure mutual objectives and create common motivation. And then usually like a backbone organization with staff and that has a specific set of skills to serve the entire initiative or coordinate the participation of all the organizations and agencies. So let's talk about safe housing solutions for survivors. So next slide. this is where the economic, social, and environmental meet. So we'll start off like just jumping right in with some of these statistics from Polaris in a 2018 research project brought to us by Polaris. I think it was called, or I'm sure it was called, the on-ramps, intersections, and exit routes. 127 survivors were surveyed, and 64% of the respondents reported being homeless or experiencing unstable housing when they were recruited. Which means that for many survivors, being unhoused was a massive vulnerability and a potential on-ramp or push-pull factor into the trafficking situation. And similarly, from January 2015 to December 2017, the National Human Trafficking Hotline learned of 1,548 potential victims experiencing unstable housing at the start of their trafficking situation. So these numbers give us a little bit of insight because something to keep in mind is that these numbers are from survivors who knew they were being trafficked, which not all survivors know that, or suspected they were being trafficked. And also numbers of folks who were aware of the Human Trafficking Hotline as a resource, which not many survivors know about as well. Next slide. So let's talk about what housing, some more intersections about housing and human trafficking. Ensuring safe and stable housing allows survivors and everyone, truly, the physical and emotional space to thrive. And what a lot of folks don't realize is that many housing providers are already serving human trafficking survivors. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about really apply to our populations overall, and as far as how to be more trauma informed and serving marginalized populations. So currently, although emergency shelters are commonly used, landlords, property managers, rental companies, developers, government agencies, all of these folks have a role to play in preventing and disrupting trafficking. So what this really drives home is that stakeholders across the housing system have a role to play in preventing and responding to trafficking. The NSN hosted a call with HUD, and the survivors from across the country just expressed like barriers to housing were on a spectrum. Next slide. And so some of these things that were mentioned will be apparent in these numbers, but some of the things mentioned were related to how landlords and property managers and rental companies would not rent to them for various reasons, like criminal records and no credit or bad credit, lack of employment history, or because of their knowledge of their survivor status. So folks would not be allowed to break a lease, even if and when they were in a crisis situation or in an emergency. In the case of public housing, folks would not respond in a timely manner or rehouse people. And also across the spectrum, housing providers deemed human trafficking survivors too high risk or too high maintenance to take on. And for labor trafficking survivors, men specifically and trans folks, shelters are limited or non-existent. So many of these organizations were also limited in their definition of interpersonal violence, therefore not able or willing to serve human trafficking survivors. So like some of the solutions we can offer for this is adapting a lot of our definitions or policies to include all forms of interpersonal violence or community violence. And it's, again, very likely that we're already serving these survivors. So expanding our cultural sensitivity and understanding to further integrate human trafficking survivors and providing comprehensive services are usually best practices. So let's talk about these numbers that we're seeing in front of us. These next few slides are really a focus on the ways that homophobia, transphobia, rejection, discrimination, bias really create massive disparities for the queer and trans community and create lack of access to health and housing and lack of access period, to like employment and all kinds of things. 44% of the population of homeless gay and transgender youth who have reported being asked by someone on the street to exchange sex for money or food. 62% of LGBTQ youth experience discrimination from their families. Youth are removed or run away from foster homes because of these issues. And 88% of professionals stated that queer youth and trans youth were not safe in group homes. Next slide. So specifically, the impact on the trans community is very significant. In a Covenant House study, 22% of respondents ages 18 to 24 had reporting being homeless at some point in their lives because of their gender identity. Folks reported having difficulty finding a safe space to sleep at night. And I know we're going to touch on what safety means to the queer and trans community shortly. And another study of HIV risk among transgender women of color ages 16 to 25 found that 18% of respondents were currently homeless. Next slide. This is some more numbers in relationship to transgender survivors specifically. 1 in 5 transgender individuals are refused housing. 1 in 3 transgender individuals are turned away from shelters, and 42% are forced to stay in the wrong gendered shelter. So some of the solutions are also to advocate for survivors who are often left out of the typical human trafficking narrative. And we're gonna also touch on what affordable or what housing in general can look like for the queer and trans community and survivors overall. But because of, next slide. Because of our policies and requirements, also sometimes folks are rejecting survivors for substance abuse disorder, and because we know that substance abuse or numbing is integrated and often heavily managed by a trafficker, or how it is used for survival. You know, instead of considering partnering with a local substance abuse disorder treatment program, oftentimes shelters will just say they can't come here until they're clean. So again, just reconsidering some of these things and how we or how we in our programming may be mirroring the power dynamics survivors were subjected to is also a good way to figure out how to move forward and help someone without necessarily enabling them. Also leaving it up to the discretion of the survivor to disclose their survivor status, like not forcing them to participate in a group, because we understand that if the group is not human trafficking specific, the experience can be isolating or stigmatizing by fellow residents because the experience is not shared. So really needing to be adaptable in our programs to serve this population, modeling how to use someone's pronouns correctly so folks are not misgendering someone, and if someone is misgendering someone, like being an ally and stepping up so that that person doesn't have to consistently be the person to correct. And when we look at the vulnerability of LGBTQ youth, these are some more numbers. Usually LGBT youth report, I'm hearing some feedback. Does anybody hear that? It's weird. LGBTQ youth report family physical violence after disclosure. They report being homeless due to rejection. They report being 2 times more likely to live in a group home placement rather than with a family. And trans folks often have way more placements on average than cisgender youth, even cisgender LGBTQ youth. And again, I wanted to mention that the reason for the distinction, like often you'll see throughout the slide that it says TGI and LGB, And that is on purpose. We're going to do a little bit of a, as I said before, like a one-on-one, but that gender and sexuality, though both on our spectrum, are completely different. So it's important to name that. Next slide.
And this is Christy, and actually add a little more. If we can go back to that last slide, I had some more information on that one.
Great.
One of the things on LGBTQ youth vulnerability, when we look at some of those numbers that we have on the prior slide, if you break this down compared to the general population, that we find LGBTQ youth are almost 8 times more likely to experience sexual violence than their peers. They're 3 to 7 times more likely to engage in survival sex. They're 2 to 10 times more likely to be held for prostitution charges when they do get picked up, instead of seen as being victims of human trafficking. And they're twice as likely to report for treatment by the foster care system. So when you look at all of these and the statistics that Jeff talked about earlier around shelter and trans people, you can see that we're setting them up just at the individual and relationship level to have a lot of issues that other youth are not facing. Next slide. So on how discrimination impacts trans survivors, we also have some things happening at the society and government level that initially when we started preparing for this presentation, it was hard to filter out which 3 things to put up here, but 3 in particular, just examples of how trans survivors experience challenges with housing and shelter include a 2020 religious exemption clause in 9 federal agencies, which means that transgender survivors, they have less access to safe housing, or less meaningful or less regional access. How good is access if we have to move someone across the state or across the country just to find somewhere for them to live? We also have, in 2019, DHHS is not going to be enforcing protections based on gender identity. And in 2019, the Department of Labor expanded exemptions from equal employment opportunity requirements around transgender survivors. We have HUD having removed homelessness requirements for LGBTQ anti-discrimination policies in 2019. And then in 2018, the Department of Health and Human Services changed the legal definition of sex to exclude transgender people. And that's the same year that they proposed, they did not succeed, but they proposed stripping sexual orientation and gender identity data from crime victim statistics, which is important because seeing those crime victim statistics broken down by orientation and gender identity is something that can help us show the need for increased services, better shelter policies, and housing. And all of these things impact survivors because these are the kinds of things at the federal level that impact people locally and make them more vulnerable to trafficking when they don't have labor protections and can be discriminated against legally in the workplace, when they don't have access to health care, when they don't have anti-discrimination policies allowing them equal access to shelter and housing. These are the kinds of things that drive people into situations where they are infinitely more vulnerable to traffickers. Next slide. And I think I'm going to be passing it over to Drea at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. So here on this slide, you'll see some bullet points on barriers to accessing housing. For time's sake purposes, I'm just going to go over 3 main ones, at least, that are problematic here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. So shelter specifically, it can have 2 main reasons why it's not safe. One being just safety of, this can be a big recruitment hub, along with people's items being stolen, which is super unfortunate because sometimes the items that they bring to shelter is really all that they have to their name in their life too. So it can be very, very sad when they get their items stolen. And then also staff are problematic in terms of lack of training, acknowledging their autonomy and their pronouns, things like that. And as we talked about before, of course, there's not enough beds for LGBTQ+. And I think some recommendations out here is to get some LGBTQ+ exclusive spaces. So we're working on in the Twin Cities, but those seem to be the 2 biggest areas that are problematic in shelters. Next would be the criminal backgrounds. Jess had talked about this a bit before. So criminal backgrounds is definitely the biggest barrier, at least to Pride participants that we have for both of our transitional housing programs. So what we can do as staff, there's 2 things things that we've tried to do to lower that barrier for them. One, we can write a letter of support to the landlord. This is catch-22 because we're also exposing what kind of program the participant is in. And that's pretty invasive, right? We're a program that serves the sexually exploited or trafficked, and someone might not want their landlord to know that. We often bring in the participant in that process if it's something that we can say that we're able to do. Sometimes a landlord is more willing to allow someone with a criminal background into their housing if they know that this participant has someone in their corner as a form of support. So one way that we try to combat that as well, though, is we host expungement clinics. So luckily, Pride is able to partner with Standpoint. This is another nonprofit here in the Twin Cities, and they provide legal aid to those that have or that have been trafficked at all. So whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And so they come here with just their legal aid. They train the lawyers as well, and then they go through that expungement process. That's been a huge success so far in our programs. And then also we have another problem is that our transitional housing programs for us, the two that we have, it's 2 years max. So what I'm finding out personally is just that 2 years might not be enough for someone. They might need a lot more time to get up and on their feet. And then next slide, I think handing it back to Jess.
Thanks, Christy. Oh, Drea, sorry. Thank you, Drea. So I appreciate that you mentioned that even though a lot of us are often interacting with survivors at a crisis, on a crisis response level, or transitional housing or reentry, that our ultimate goal is long-term sustainable housing and extended recovery for survivors. And the landlord whispering is like one of my favorite terms. Which really just means providing housing advocacy, which is so huge. But let's talk about how to best work with survivors of human trafficking. Next slide. This work begins with learning how to be a good ally. And what that means, down here it says ally is a verb, not a noun. And what that means is that being a good ally means constantly working alongside the community you are allying yourself to, which can sometimes take the form of stepping up and sometimes can mean stepping back. So some tips on how to be allies. Number one is acknowledging your privilege. Some examples of this can be like, what is your definition of success? And when we think about that, are we projecting that definition onto our client? And it's super important to consider, because although we want to do we want what's best for the person we're working with, we don't know what's best, and we don't know what's actually that person is actually capable of. If you're experiencing, clinical depression and a complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and you haven't been able to sleep or whatever, oftentimes a victory can mean getting out of bed, taking a shower, and brushing your teeth and showing up to something with a stank attitude, and that is a massive victory. And I think that if we started celebrating those small successes, it would help that client, in the ways that they need to build up to whatever definition of success that they have. Another piece is to listen. And that seems pretty basic, but it's actually super complex in the sense that we oftentimes are doing a lot more talking than we are listening. And that's important, because if we're committed to learning and unlearning, which sort of means that we're all guilty of stereotyping someone at some point in our lives. So we have to listen in order to learn from one another, and to deconstruct some of those biases and learn essentially the truth. And we can only do that by centering those who are impacted, and not centering what we think about those who are impacted. And of course, by educating others, once we have this knowledge, and getting involved, which can mean politically, within our organizations, with our families, and supporting survivors at every stage of their lives, not just when they're doing good or when they're doing what we want them to do, but really, at every stage in the process, and sharing our resources, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. Next slide. So let's just talk a little bit about LGBTQ identities. So identifying as trans can mean something different to everyone. So trans is not singular, it's multifaceted. For example, we can use the words trans woman, trans female, a two-spirit person, non-binary person, a genderqueer person, a trans-masked person, et cetera, et cetera. There's no one way to be trans. And another piece that's important to know is that identities can and do change and or evolve based on context, culture, geography, safety, and an individual's place on their life journey. I think another piece that we often hear is like, wasn't it this the other day? And it's like, yeah, it was like this the other day. We can let go of that now, and today it's this. So another piece to know is that sexuality is on a spectrum. Similarly, it's not like, what are you? That's a very personal and invasive question, and B, it can look differently for everybody. So these words that we have as to label things are useful in some ways, but they're also don't allow us to understand the sort of depth of these identities. Next slide. So we're also going to touch a little bit about, I guess, actually Christy did a really beautiful job of doing this in general when it came to a lot of the policy issues being looked at. But, when we think about the lived realities and the medical issues, but when you think about the realities of LGBTQ people, there are a lot of discrimination and biases that exist when a group is marginalized. Next slide.
Okay. So this is Christy again, and we're going to move on into housing LGBTQ survivors. So we've been talking a good bit about just the realities, the definitions, the terms, just the background information, the social and cultural context in which people live every day. And so now we're going to get into some specifics around housing. And next slide. So one of the things I want to bring up for you is that we need to think about what we mean by safety. And so it's very easy, especially for someone who has not lived under an experience of oppression, whether that's racism or homophobia or transphobia, for someone who maybe doesn't have the lived experience of homelessness or of trafficking, it's very easy to have a very specific definition of safety in mind, and to be very confused when someone that you're working with doesn't seem to have the same definition of safety that you do. So I want to talk about what safety actually means. So there's safety at different levels. There's whether or not you feel a sense of safety in your community or your neighborhood, your relationship to the community in which you live, whether or not it's accepting of who you are, again, thinking specifically of LGBTQ survivors and LGBTQ people in general. There's safety in relationship. Do you feel safe in your relationship with your family, your parents, siblings, with your partners? And I also want to get you thinking about the fact that someone's going to have an opinion about how safe they feel in their relationship with you as a service provider. And this is where some of that stuff that Jess was talking about earlier around how to help someone feel seen and heard, using their pronouns, acknowledging their lived experiences, listening to them and being a good ally builds a sense of safety in their relationship with you, which those of you who've worked with survivors of trafficking know that sometimes it's really hard for survivors to regain that sense of safety in relationship with anyone. And so you having a chance to show up as a good ally is not just checking a box or trying to like hit a mark in terms of showing that you're inclusive. It's really about helping that person feel safe in the professional relationship that they have with you. So I want you to think about these things that you do around LGBTQ inclusivity, not just as inclusivity or equity. They're that, but they're also about helping that person learn to experience safety with you. Thinking about safety in the body. So safety can mean that your body has these reactions, these trauma responses, whether or not you can relax in your body and do the healing work that you need to do after an experience like trafficking is going to be dependent on how safe you feel in your context and in your relationships. And so I want you to remember that when things happen like constant misgendering, forcing someone to live as a different gender in order to receive services, putting them in the wrong gender housing, these are things that create a lack of safety in someone's experience that's then going to make it hard for them to do any kind of meaningful healing or recovery because they're going to be constantly triggered into trauma responses through the experience of the services that they're providing when they're not sensitized to their needs. This is where trans-inclusive housing can still sometimes feel unsafe. I've seen transgender survivors get placed into shelters where they then experience harassment from other residents. So in a lot of times, even if your staff have good training and are doing their best to get things right, the fact is, if you aren't keeping a safe environment with regard to how residents treat each other, then it's not going to feel safe. And I also want you to be very clear about theory versus practice, policy versus reality. I've noticed a large number of you checked yes that your agency is LGBTQ inclusive in that poll at the beginning of the webinar, and that's very heartening. And also, we always have to be self-critical that just because we've done diversity trainings, we've attended a few webinars, we have pronouns and a write-in for gender identity on our intake forms, doesn't mean that we're still getting everything right. So be aware that having a policy that says things are going to be safe and inclusive is different from actually doing the work to create safety for your trans and other lesbian, gay, and bisexual cisgender survivors. Next slide. I'm going to be passing it over to Drea to talk some about safety planning.
Thank you, Christy. So yeah, Pride has multiple safety plans that we offer within our organization. For the purpose of this, of course, I will just talk about safety planning for LGBTQ who may be in an unsafe home or environment. One thing I want to hit home right away is to remember this is their safety plan. You really have to approach this as a harm reduction approach of, I might think it's safer for, as an example, for a youth to go, into this shelter and out of some abusive home. That might not be what's safe for them. So one thing is just to remember that this is their safety plan, and what you're doing is helping them go about whatever situation it is, hopefully in the safest way possible. So for this specific example, again, is LGBTQ that might feel unsafe in their home or environment. We talk about mostly, is it safe for you to come out to your parent or guardian or whoever you're living with? Usually what I'm hearing is often that, no, I'm afraid that they will throw me out of the house or not accept me. So then we start thinking of, okay, it's very important to feel like you fit in or have a sense of culture or community. So then we talk about who can you come out to then? Who it seems like a safe space for you? So we really try to get that social support network in there for them, if there's anyone that they can list. And then we just talk about maybe this isn't a good time to come out or whatever ideas it might be. But those seem to be the most prominent ones that we have at Pride, is just what's a safe space to come out to then if it's not at home. And then I'll kick it back to Christy.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you brought up that how we might assess that someone's home is a safer place for them to be on the street. That's so important. I actually worked with a survivor who ended up finding a shelter placement where they were being bullied by some of the other residents, and they left that shelter and went back to their trafficker because they felt safer with their trafficker than they did in a shelter receiving constant transphobic bullying from other residents and lack of support from the staff. So we really need to work hard, to do the work that goes along with the policy. Next slide. So one option that's not the right option for everybody, there are some limitations to it, but that I want to make sure everyone is aware of, is there are a handful of host home programs across the country. And we have the link here for Point Source Youth, which is one agency that is helping provide support and technical assistance and training to get people up and running in their agencies with host home programs. The way that works, depending, and it can be multiple varieties of methods. Some of them are through a formal nonprofit. You may even find host home programs that are really informal. So the ones that happen through a formal nonprofit, what they do is they will organize and have maybe a case manager and a host home program coordinator and maybe some other staff as needed and as their capacity allows. And they will find people who have a spare bedroom, and they will give them a good bit of training and support. But again, the people who are taking in young people, usually ages 18 to 24 is what Point Source Youth usually works with, although they do have some who work with minors depending on the program. But what it's still just everyday average loving parents, loving people and adults taking people into their homes. They're not all social workers. You're not going to find that they have comprehensive programming in their setting. This is just a family that's received some training. And then the host home program, if it's one through a more formal structure, will provide things like case management and ongoing financial support to make sure that that family is not taking on the full burden of taking care of that survivor, and that trafficking survivor has access to things like transportation to get them to and from programming. So the case managers typically run that. There are some informal mutual aid host home programs. I know that in North Carolina, for example, we have one called an agency called Transmission, that basically theirs is just an informal list of people who've said, I'll take a trans person into my spare bedroom before I'll let them be homeless. And there's not training, and there's not case management, and there's not support for that, but there is a definite commitment to ending homelessness and vulnerability for LGBTQ individuals. So if you want to collaborate with a host home program, and Point Source Youth has supported programs across the country, so if you go to their website, you can find some of theirs. If you want to collaborate, you're going to want to be prepared to offer reassurance and dispel myths around trafficking survivors. You're also going to want to recognize this might not be the best fit for all of the survivors you work with, but typically when people hear trafficking survivors, part of it's because there's been this very unusual like sensationalizing of trafficking in the media. If they hear trafficking survivor, they have it in their head that this is someone who's scary to be around, or you know, just not a safe person to bring into their home. And I may not understand that a lot of times trafficking survivors could be anything from a homeless minor who was having to engage in the sex trade to survive, or someone who's engaged in survival sex. So offer reassurance, dispel myths, help them understand who they would be bringing into their home. You're going to want to remember their limitations around professional capacity. These are not therapeutic homes. These are not well-resourced residential programs. So again, keep that in mind when thinking about what kind of partnerships you might have. You're going to want to remember their financial limitations. They may not be well-funded. So if you call them and are interested in seeing if there's a survivor who might be a good fit for staying in one of their host homes, you be prepared with your agency to outline the kinds of support you can offer. We need a home for this person, but we have a stipend for the young person so they won't need to be, or for the survivor so they won't need to be asking you for money. We have someone who can provide case management so you won't have to worry about helping them schedule appointments and meetings. We have therapy that we provide for them. We can get them transportation to substance abuse treatment, you know, like whatever it is that you need to do, you make sure that you're laying out what you can do to support them so that they know you're not expecting them to do your job. They may also have time limitations in terms of how long someone can stay in a host home, and they may also have age limitations. I know most of the ones with Point Source Youth are 18 to 24-year-olds. Next slide. So one of the things that in my county, I'm on my county's homelessness board, our COC, and one of the things that one of our local nonprofits has funded is brilliant, and I forget what the formal title of this person is. I feel kind of silly, but I like to call them the landlord whisperer. And what that is someone whose whole staff position, their whole job is to build relationships with landlords, property managers, to continue providing them with education and information and staying in touch, building good community with them. And that way you can have some landlords in mind when you have someone to find a home for, a rental home, an apartment. You have a list of landlords that you know are willing to take a risk on someone that other people might not take that risk on. So this could be a position that if one agency can't fund the whole position, maybe it can be a shared position between another homelessness or housing agency. So think about creative ways to make this happen. You maintain your list of potential landlords willing to work with you. You're going to want to be prepared to dispel myths again and provide education and reassurance about survivors of trafficking, about accepting vouchers or third-party assistance and what that process looks like. Find out what their fears are. This is what your landlord whisperer does, is find out what are the fears that are keeping landlords from wanting to work with this person, and how can we troubleshoot to make sure they're getting their needs met too. In some cases, that might mean that you dedicate funds to supplement existing security deposits as assurance. So say you have a security deposit fund, so you're able to pay, I don't know, say someone has $1,000 security deposit. Well, then they say, well, what if this person, because they're higher risk, bails out and I end up being more than $1,000 in the hole? Well, then maybe your agency can provide supplemental assurance around any damages beyond the security deposit. So that's another way to sometimes overcome challenges with landlords. And next slide, I'm going to turn it back over to Treya.
Thank you, Christy. So next I'll just talk about the Pride housing services that we currently have. As mentioned before, we have 2 scattered site housing. We have one for the adult side that serves ages 25 years old and above, and then we have the youth side, which is 24 years old and younger. It's really cool that we are able to serve across a lifespan, meaning that we're not restricted to what Christy touched on a little bit before, of that age of 18 to 24. We can serve adults too. So that's been really good, is getting funding that can serve more than just beyond the age of 24. So again, talking about this slide, we are having issues getting those that are identified as trans housed. I don't know if the barrier so much is just housing, since we have scattered site housing. It's more of what Christy talked about before with, having a criminal background and then needing to establish that rapport with landlords. So luckily, Pride, we do have a list of landlords that we happen to work with, and their understanding of criminal backgrounds, getting more informed in trauma-informed training, also LGBTQ inclusive training. So we're striving towards that. It's gotten somewhat better, but unfortunately, again, we still haven't really housed any trans folk. We've mostly housed cisgender, bi, and lesbian, which is great. But again, it's showing a reflection that our organization has some sort of gap that we need to fill, whether we're getting input from those of the trans community on how to fill that or what's going on. So hopefully what I addressed before with having the expungement clinics, trying to get rid of barriers, and then now building rapport with landlords, we can get our transitional housing programs really open to everyone like we say it is. Next slide.
And that's me.
And sorry, Jess, this will be.
Yep, that's me. Thanks, Treya. So what we are gathering from our discussion is that there isn't a perfect solution, and a lot about what we're going to talk about is related to just being client-centered. Next slide. Often called, survivor-centered or victim-centered, empowerment-centered, they all refer to the same thing. It essentially means being person-centered, individualized approaches that honor self-determination, agency, and co-constructed plans based on discussion and informed consent and informed compromise. And these are a lot of the things that we have seen folks in this community, LGBTQ survivors, need and use and benefit from. High-risk case management for public housing survivors. This is something that existed in New York City through the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence, which I think was rebranded as gender-based violence recently. There was a high-risk case management section that we had folks on the ground at the 15 housing developments that accounted for most of the reported domestic violence and trafficking. And once we were connected to the community in that way, we were able to really serve as a resource, and folks would come to us, and we were able to get them rehoused in a system that usually takes a lot of proof and time to get rehoused in. So we've used emergency shelters, we've used transitional living shelters, which you just heard about, rehab centers for substance abuse, LGBTQ specific housing, as Dre was mentioning, rapid rehousing programs. But we have, and community support that was in various different ways, whether it be those host homes or community, like queer community spaces and queer organizations that, and trans organizations, gender justice organizations that are working to also build supportive networks for queer people. Other things that have helped are queer co-ops, which are just conscious communities of queer people. And once folks can become if you hit up your local LGBTQ center, you may be able to tap into that resource where there are just folks who are creating these communities and these living spaces, because it's often easier to find roommates that you sort of have this baseline shared understanding with. Obviously, white supremacy can still be an issue, and community violence, but it's often a better housing option than trying to find roommates, off of a Craigslist or something like that. Another thing that's not on this list that I've seen be invested in are community land trust models, because the cost of housing in many markets are just skyrocketing. Activists are responding by organizing around housing equity and against displacement, and are looking for sort of effective tools to create these inclusive communities. So one of those things are the community land trusts, and it's just basically a form of permanent affordable housing where community-controlled organizations retain ownership of the land and sell or rent housing on that land to lower-income households. And that's another really great tool to look into. Next slide.
All right, so now we're going to talk a good bit about collaboration and community engagement. And one of the things we all know is that human trafficking survivors need a multidisciplinary response. You have to network. And so I know that if you are a human trafficking agency or serve trafficking survivors, you're already used to having a network with the homelessness systems and with detox, with therapeutic and mental health systems. And so if you want to be able to effectively serve LGBTQ survivors, you're also going to have to network with other LGBTQ serving organizations. So next slide. Some collaboration with LGBTQ affirming partners might include working with LGBTQ centers and other advocacy organizations. So they may be good partners for professional and staff development for your housing and case management organizations. They can help you with things like reviewing and updating your intake forms to be inclusive, reviewing your policy manuals to see where there might be gaps that are causing LGBTQ people to not receive sensitized services. Some of them may have housing assistance programs. I know near me, I know in North Carolina, like I mentioned earlier, the informal housing host home program is run through a transgender serving nonprofit in the mountains. I know that both of our local host home programs in North Carolina, one in Durham and one in Charlotte, are operated by LGBTQ organizations. So when you start making these connections, you're going to be better equipped to serve LGBTQ survivors that you're working with. You can get a contract with them to come in and help you review how to do better. This is not on this slide, but specific to COVID right now, we've seen a big rise in the number of mutual aids that have come up. And so if you look around, you may find that there are mutual aid funds specific for LGBTQ people of color or for trans people of color. So look around and see what's happening. Those are very grassroots efforts. They are philosophically about getting around and outside of the normal service systems that maybe aren't meeting people's needs. And they typically don't have the nonprofit status. They might not be able to fundraise at the level that you do, but if you find a way to partner with them in a way that's helping these little scrappy mutual aid programs that are really taking care of people and meeting needs that we can't, you're going to strengthen the kinds of services and options that you're going to have for your survivors. So if you do work with mutual aid, make sure you're elevating their work as well. You're going to want to work with your rape crisis centers and your domestic violence centers, because then they have shelters available or money for temporary housing. They can be a good place for networking to find new solutions, might be able to support you with crisis services, case management. They might have therapy groups or support groups. And then harm reduction organizations are another really great option. They may have, they do a lot of outreach to sex workers and to trans people. They might offer needle exchanges. And I know that sometimes trans people will use those needle exchanges to get access to needles for hormones. Some of them also have what we call a linkage to care coordinator, who's basically the go button that they push when someone they've been working with says, I think I want to go get treatment. And that linkage to care coordinator may have contacts and relationships with people at detox centers, shelters, other service providers that they could help you out with. Next slide. So just a few suggestions when you're collaborating with LGBTQ affirming organizations. Be real clear on your values and principles and frameworks, but also be willing to listen, learn, and shift. Some of these agencies might have different frameworks than you do because they've been listening to LGBTQ people perhaps longer than your HT movement has. So use clear language around bodily autonomy and consent. I know that there are a lot of people in the LGBTQ community that I've worked with who are a little bit resistant when they hear talk about anti-human trafficking, because conflation is often a trigger point. People who conflate consensual sex work and sex trafficking as being the same thing, a lot of times that will hinder your ability to interact and work well with LGBTQ agencies. Do your internal work and build on what you have in common as your starting point when you're working with someone who maybe has a different framework. Next slide, and I'm passing it back over to Drea.
Thank you again, Christy. So I'll talk a little bit more about community engaged development. So this is where it really hits home with Christy's marks on just getting the input of those that really need to be at the table. So for example, my former role at Pride was the male and LGBTQ advocate. What we had done was some research to really help our service provisions with my role. You know, my title was male and LGBTQ, but I definitely knew that we were not equipped to actually serve those populations. So this is how it can tie into, you know, helping fix and make service provisions within our housing programs. One main reason why is I'm not a survivor. I don't have lived experience. So if I were to be making any sort of provisions, it simply would be off of assumptions of what I think they need. So this is why it's really important to get that those with lived experience and or service providers involved in these conversations. So when I had done service provisions for the male and LGBTQ role, we actually had a night where we hosted a dinner and had a 3-hour long conversation on what needs to change and what could be better. After that, then we also had one-on-one interviews with anyone who decided they wanted to do that as well. Another big thing though is that we have to pay them for their time, right? We don't want to further exploit them by saying, hey, you know, give me all this information on how we can improve, and then not really compensating them for that. So we did pay them $25 an hour using a gift card, and then we also paid them again for that separate interview, and then included a meal. Me and the research fellow that I partnered with, we also made up a set of values and expectations that we had of each other, and then we asked that the community engaged group would also give us expectations that they had from us. So a big part of it was to just not, you know, impact the participants' well-being. We don't want to further damage anything, you know, that they could have just recovered from, or further impact them or re-victimize them within the program. So this is a way that we can put Pride's research that we've done for that male and LGBTQ role and really use it in terms of service provisions with both of our housing programs. Next slide, going to
Thanks, Drea. Another piece that feels important to mention is that, our survivor leaders at NSN, they are considered subject matter experts. So their consultant rates are comparable with just consultant rates in general for any subject matter expertise. And that's really important, especially if we're talking about economic development and empowerment. So let's talk about how we move ahead. Next slide. When we talk about person-centered care a little further, I think one of the main things I would love to stress is the bottom bullet point about practicing harm reduction. When we talk about harm reduction, Chrissy did a great job touching on this. And really what we're talking about is models of support or treatment or an approach to risky behavior, like self-harm or substances or sexual behavior or suicidality, and the focus being to minimize the harm that may come from that risky behavior. So this can almost feel like a willingness to tolerate engagement in the behavior, but it's because we recognize that a person has, ultimately the person has autonomy and free will, and only they can decide what's best for them, or even stop doing what they're doing, right? If that's the ultimate goal for them. And if we're talking about, empowerment-centered engagement, our role is that of a support. It's really just responsible for engaging in dialogue and demonstrating like a willingness to explore what risks are present. So a person can determine the benefits and the risk of a behavior and manage that risk, because that's what we're teaching, right? That's what we're trying to get that person to do for themselves in their long-term journey. And this approach doesn't require abstinence for engagement, but it more so normalizes why a person may benefit from that behavior and how that behavior is serving them. And by doing this, we make space to look at the issue and to think critically about it, which can often lead to like rebellion or resignation or rationalization, but or even reluctance or reveling. But these are all things we need to process. And by doing this, we create space to look at an issue or even evaluate if it's a problem, because you can't change something that you don't even see as a problem. Next slide. So when we talk about trauma-informed approaches, these are some of the main takeaways about what that means. Christy also did a really great job talking about safety in community as far as it relates to housing services like the neighborhood, the service relationship, or the cultural, racial safety, all of those pieces. But trustworthiness is really important to me, because I think that trustworthiness is spelled time. Like it's literally just requires time. And sometimes it can be a really long, rough road before this is totally achieved, because trust is proven over time. And I think that if we're modeling corrective experiences, we shouldn't just expect someone to trust you like right away, because oftentimes that behavior is sort of what could have led to some of the trafficking situation. So how do we continue to show up? How do we for that client? And again, empowerment in every facet of the program. Next slide. When we talk about the level of approach, this essentially can be like wrapped up by saying it's services that do no additional harm. So are we breaking down the goal into manageable steps? Are we setting folks up for success? Which really leads me to, are we considering, the trauma history and what needs are present and are met and unmet? But really just leads me to empathy. So next slide. Oh, this is not the empathy slide, but let's talk about what's needed. These are all things that we're doing now. Training, collaboration, all these things are super important. Accommodating the needs of survivors, as we've stated throughout. the things that I would really like to touch on are the working with youth and their families. When we're talking about youth specifically, I think a lot of the times we don't think about the parent as part of the service provision, but that's really important because oftentimes we can do a lot with working with a family that is just having a difficult time accepting or normalizing the fact that people are queer or trans, and that can be really helpful. Another important thing to mention is changing organizational culture because a lot of the things we mentioned are really awesome, but are we able to essentially where we work is in many ways is like the first step. We're trying to do a lot of work outside in the world and in culture and changing culture, but oftentimes that work needs to happen at home first, essentially, and that can mean challenging our own organization to step up in many ways. And I would like to just touch on the term queering. A lot of time this term is used in regards to diversity and inclusion, like just like talking about how to include people. But I'm more so talking about transcending judgment and tolerance in general. I think that organizations have always been places that encourage people to show up with this like narrow professional self and to sort of check other parts of themselves at the door. And this can often require us to like show up a certain way and to hide our doubts or to hide our vulnerabilities and to display determination and strength only. And I think the emotional and the intuitive and those spiritual parts of ourselves are often unwelcome or out of place. But if we can develop a consistent set of practices that invite us to like sort of reclaim our inner wholeness and bring all of who we are constantly, that's more of the concept I'm talking about here. Because a lot of the times this work is thought about in terms of tolerance, and I think we can move even further beyond that. Next slide. I guess there is not an empathy side, but that's okay. Let's talk more about what else is needed. These are things that have helped with all of the concepts that we've sort of placed in your lap today. Having our organizations really align with human rights and public health framework really helps move a lot of these things along, especially as it relates to population health and health equity, which housing is a part of. Other things, beyond, I think, affordable long-term housing. I think that the term affordable housing has been misleading. Oftentimes, people say affordable to who? So I think that's a big part of the work, just redefining that and investing in that. Living wages are so important. I think that businesses are in like a unique position to address the needs of survivors of human trafficking by helping them to access and build the social capital that supports their resilience. Through their own operations and their partnerships with other organizations, like businesses can provide not just employment, but also paid internships and apprenticeships that allow survivors to build like critical resume building skills as they form these new relationships. These relationships serve them in the present and beyond. And so if businesses that like are really truly trying to, and organizations as well, that are seeking to create a trauma-informed workplace can support the growth and success of their employees through this approach to the work. And I think work sometimes will help an individual who often thought of themselves as disadvantaged will help them to think of themselves as gifted. Like that motivates someone to think, oh, I have assets, right? Like being asset-based is really, really important. And that will inspire like the true agency that's sort of required to affect change like in your own life and as well as your community. So other things that survivors benefit from, especially in the beginning when they're leaving their trafficking situation, are competent legal services throughout the legal service spectrum because there's many different issues faced. Medical support, you know, that community care piece, the mutual aid piece is so important, Christy. Like, trans people have been taking care of themselves since the beginning. So that's important to invest in those spaces and in those communities. Empowering survivor-led solutions and providing educational opportunities for survivors. Next slide. So thank you for joining us. I think I am passing it over to Karen.
Yes, thank you so much, Jess. This has been fantastic, and we definitely want to get to some of the questions that have been coming in. So let's get started. We just had a question around pronouns. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Christy to talk about how to do some work around pronouns.
Sure, yeah. So there is a resource called Forge, and their website is forge-forward.org. And Forge is a national nonprofit that provides training and technical assistance around trans inclusivity. And they have a Pronouns 101 mini-series that just got shared. That's a series of videos that sort of can help you understand why it's important, how that helps people feel safe and seen and valued, how you can handle it if you make a misstep, if you mess up, or if you hear someone else call someone the wrong pronouns, how you can handle that with grace without making it all about you. So I think the easiest thing to do for that question is to point you towards this excellent resource.
Perfect, thank you. The next question, we'll start off with Drea. What are some ways that we can address homophobia and transphobia in shelters, especially when the staff are citing faith as their basis for their beliefs?
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, that's a really great question because we do often worry about how the Church Institute can really hurt our participants. Luckily, Pride, at least me myself, hasn't ran into that issue that I know of. A way that we try to combat this ahead of time, like more preventative work, is we actually offer to walk through the shelter with the youth or participant. That way we can kind of do like a warm transfer of that as well. And then also part of our street outreach training, we actually had assignments to tour the shelters as well. That way we can get a feel if a participant wants to actually join a faith-based, shelter or any sort of drop-in center, thing like that. And then also, I think if I were to come into this issue though, right, if I did have someone where I found out how, if they were homophobic or transphobic, I would definitely try to have more of a teaching moment than a shaming moment. And more so versus, not a lot of people respond to shame super well. If I can at least, drop a few seeds in there and just try to have a teaching moment of how, are you really faith-based, or is this, are you actually serving the people without trying to necessarily act as something I'm not as well, that can be a hard conversation. But again, I think I just mostly believe in those teaching moments and really advocating for our participants, vouching for them if need be, if we need to take it to someone higher up to help file a report or something like that. Again, I leave that in the, as the participant and what they would want to do. Hopefully that answered your question. It can be a bit of a loaded one.
Drea, I can also add to that. I really appreciate that you mentioned that piece about just having as much information as possible. I think in general, trauma survivors often need as much information about a situation as is available. And that kind of seems intense to others, but folks who have lived through so much uncertainty around areas that are out of their control, need to have the facts about the areas that are in your control, so to feel safe. So definitely saying this is a space that is probably not going to respect this, that, the other, if that's the only thing that's available, right, for the time being. But these are the ways that you can spend your time outside of that space in places that will be affirming to sort of counterbalance or counteract what's happening. But yeah, I think also just, from the beginning, just sharing with people that discrimination isn't tolerated, as soon as you hire someone. And then in general, I think everyone needs to every organization should not just have the one training, right? The one training where everyone gets all the information and never does it again. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So just staying attuned to unconscious bias and further examining any anti-Blackness, fat phobia, ableism, transphobia, trans antagonism, classism, and internalized racism or supremacy, in our programming in our relationships at all time is really, really, really the work.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. And this actually leads us into another question I wanted to get your insight on. And it's talking about how do you address racial equity in housing of LGBTQ plus survivors of human trafficking? So Jess, if you want to go ahead and take that one.
Sure. I mean, the best thing I can say is that this like is a issue that's like not just specific to our movements. It's or housing. It's specific to like our society. So I think we can really like the best that we can do for a survivor specifically that we're helping is to or almost like unrelentlessly like stand by that person and not let, like, I think there are power in numbers. And so when we are saying, hi, this person is experiencing, I mean, it's easy for one person sort of be gaslighted and told like, no, that's not happening or something. It's a different story when there's accountability processes, right? And something sort of needs to be looked at because it's causing an issue, and someone and other folks have your back to help support through that process. So it's again, like like Drea, it's a broader issue, and I think that we have to support folks through those processes because, you know, we're really like there's a lot at play, and I can say in general, like to advocating for like supportive supervision so that you have a space to process anything that's happening and you have a team that can support you through this is also important, because, you know, these things are like the issues of our time. So we have to create, you know, a space to process this compassion fatigue and this burnout, and being given options to deal with those things, because we're dealing with a lot of different, you know, intersectional problems. So beyond like being the support system for someone else, like making sure you have a support system.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jess. The next question is for Christy. You had mentioned a little bit about host homes. Do you know what is a way to find those homes? Are there any lists, or how does one go to look for those?
Yeah, so Point Source Youth has a lot of good information on their website about the host home programs that they work with, that they've helped sponsor and provide training with. Honestly, beyond that, in connection with runaway and homeless youth programs, one of the best ways to find out where these are is just to really start building your relationship with your local LGBTQ community, with your local LGBTQ centers, who's doing the organizing. Just start building those relationships. Go to some of their events, get to know them, figure out how you can support each other. And once you build those relationships, you'll be in on the things that only people in the know about, and you'll also be in on some of the like whisper networks of how you find information out once you're connected to a community.
Great, thank you. The next question is again for Christy, and also Drea and Jess, feel free to jump in. Somebody asked if they're thinking about opening a transgendered house or houses. They're thinking maybe doing one for female identified individuals, one for male identified individuals, as opposed to having one trans house. Is that, what would you all suggest? Does that seem like the way to go, or is there a different model?
Well, if you have gendered housing, you're going to want to talk to the person about where they feel safest, for starters, because that survivor's perception of their safety is going to be really important. But some of the models that I've seen that have worked really well for any LGBTQ, but especially trans and gender nonconforming survivors, is a model where they have like scattered site, where maybe they have a townhome or a series of townhomes that have small separate bedrooms, so people have their own space, and you don't have to worry as much about the strict segregation by gender. But that's one way to get around that.
Perfect, thank you so much. The next question is for Drea, and the question is, how do you provide assistance to LGBTQ plus high-risk youth if they do not want to share their identity, but they want a safe place to be housed?
Yeah, that's another great question. So two things to that. Again, that Pride is really fortunate for the youth side. They don't have to even identify that, one, they're being trafficked or exploited. Luckily, we can usually build a case around them just being at risk. So LGBTQ is definitely something that falls under at risk. So they don't even have to tell us that they're LGBTQ, although we do offer it, like Christy said, like, making your forms more inclusive and things like that. So we leave it up to them if, one, they want to identify. And then I'm reading the question, sorry, one moment. The other piece of it then is, okay, if they're not identifying, well, then how are we as an agency reaching that community? So this is actually, again, part of more of that research that I had done as the former male and LGBTQ advocate, is that we just have to do really more intentional outreach. So for example, since the research, we actually partnered with the Red Door Clinic. So of course, I don't expect everyone to know what this is, but the Red Door Clinic does HIV rapid testing, a lot of services that encompass the LGBTQ plus community, and everyone else too. So that's one way that we go about it. Hopefully that answered that question as well.
Great, perfect, thank you. The next question is for Christy, and it's a very full one. So knowing that there have been some policy recommendations by the administration or by different systems that interact with survivors of trafficking, where they may encourage discrimination or open up for discrimination in public housing, especially towards the trans community, how are ways that this could be addressed, especially if it may lead to some transphobia? So Christy, if you want to go ahead and kick us off, and Drea and Jess, if you have anything to add.
Well, I know that we've all seen some of the stuff in the news, or you probably have seen some of the things in the news where not only has there been guidance to not protect gender identity, but there's been recommendations around things like examining people's bodies for signs that they might be trans when bringing them into a shelter, looking for an Adam's apple. And I think especially for anyone in a vulnerable situation, but especially when we're talking about survivors of complex trauma, especially if any of that trauma had to do with sexuality, the idea of examining the intimate details of someone's body to stamp them with your seal of approval is really invasive and gross, and it also can harm anybody seeking access. Not only is it a form of transphobia that harms trans survivors who need housing and shelter, it's also harmful to cisgender people who are not gender expressive in a way that fits our society's norms. So are we going to start examining any person of any gender who steps outside of gender norms to check their bodies or voice for signs that we are going to be able to deny them services based on our discriminatory beliefs? Like, this is not an acceptable practice for anyone at all, especially not for anyone working with vulnerable populations and survivors of trauma.
Great, thank you so much, Christy. That's very helpful. The next question is around COVID. So knowing that this is a global pandemic and it has impacted everyone and probably has added a heightened vulnerability to survivors of trafficking in our vulnerable communities, what have you seen as the impact for COVID, or for survivors of trafficking who are LGBTQ and trans survivors? What have you seen as the impact, especially during COVID, as it's related to housing? So Christy, if you want to start us off, and then we'd also love to hear from Jess and Drea on what you're seeing now.
I can start, and then I'll definitely pass it on. But one of the things I wanted to note around housing is I'm finding in my region that services and funds are tapped out quicker. So a lot of our shelters, DV programs, who normally would have some funding for hotel stays, because their shelters have been at limited capacity due to them trying to implement practices to slow the spread of COVID, they're running through their hotel and other funds faster than they normally would. And so what I'm finding in my community is that a lot of that gap is being met by mutual aid networks, where we're seeing anything from a formal QTI POC mutual aid to a survivor mutual aid, that they're operating in different ways. It might just be a one-time cash disbursement if they raise money and distribute it to people in need. I know the mutual aid in my community has a private secret Facebook group for all the recipients, and they then democratically vote and make decisions about how the money is spent each month and who gets what level of support. I also know that sometimes mutual aid just looks like someone making a Facebook post and saying, I have a person who needs housing and is in crisis. Can we raise $300 by tomorrow so that we can fund a hotel through the next few days? You know, so what I'm seeing is that a lot of the work being done to fill in those gaps is just being done by concerned community members, taking care of each other and taking care of themselves.
Yeah, I can add to that. So a lot of the folks in Los Angeles that I'm connected to, and a lot of I'm like fortunate enough to have insurance, but a lot of other folks I know don't. And so they depended on wellness centers that were trans wellness centers. And all of those, basically access to like healthcare in general, but specifically gender affirming healthcare, has been very limited because of the situation where just people are not trying to see as many clients, not open as many hours. And as it relates to housing specifically, you know, folks are moving back into very exploitative situations because it's not as, just like with every other population, like you can't shelter at home if you don't have a home. So, you know, lots of rates of folks going back to traffickers that are living or who are living in, you know, like domestic violence, interpersonal violence situations or family violence situations. The rates of mental illness, suicidality have gone up. The organizations that people depended on for food and clothing and things like that are also affected. So, I mean, it's been what you would expect of already super marginalized populations, you know, getting hit with a pandemic. It's pretty much what you would expect, and it's unfortunate and horrible.
Thank you, Jess. And we have, I think, time for one more question. So Drea, can you answer the question that came in, is when doing research with LGBTQ plus youth, how do you preserve anonymity but still track data and progress of specific individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question because of course we want to definitely honor that some people might not want to be identified while others do want to be acknowledged. So when it came to like publishing the research or presenting at the JUST conference, I had done the one in Ohio in October of 2019, the Juvenile Sex Trafficking Conference. We actually asked them, how do you want to be acknowledged? Again, do you want to remain anonymous, or would you like to be given or have your name like posted, or however you want to identify? So we definitely let them say that for themselves, how they would want to be identified if they'd want to be. The nice thing about the data that we were pulling is that we didn't have to necessarily track any sort of data or progress. Fortunately, that doesn't pertain to this type of research, but hopefully that answered the question as well, as we just definitely left it up to them and how they would like to be acknowledged.
Thank you, Drea. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next slide. And so we just wanted to give you some ways to keep in touch. That we have a resource library where we'll upload this recording. You'll also get an email in the next week or two with the follow-up recording, as well as anything that was listed as a resource. We'll make sure to attach it there. And if you have any questions or you want to connect with any of the presenters, go ahead and shoot us an email and we're happy to get you in touch with them. We really appreciate all the questions and discussion that came through. Next slide. All right, we're gonna go ahead and close it out, and just again, thank you for your participation. Thank you for joining us, and we would love to get any feedback on this webinar to be able to understand what you enjoyed, what was helpful, and also what we can improve. We thank you, and we look forward to hearing and being with you in our next webinar.